Greetings everyone, and welcome to LEGO Rewind, where we take another look at old retired LEGO themes. In the earlier days of Rewind, I said I wasn't going to dedicate an episode to Castle because there are too many Castle sub-themes to cover all at once, but the show's continued a good deal longer than I imagined, and in that time we've covered Vikings, Dragon Knights or Dragon Masters, Fright Knights, Knights Kingdom 1 and 2, Nexo Knights, and Ninja. That's like half of them already done. And while there are still many years to go through, LEGO's releases used to be slower than they are now. You only see 1 or 2 Castle sets a year, so I'd say rounding up the rest is perfectly doable. It's the Explorians episode again, but with Castle. Let us make haste! The first few years are pretty basic. This was the 70s, LEGO was still finding itself with minifigs and themes like town and space just taking off. A big yellow castle like this may be garish, but while the outsides tend to be pretty plain, real castle interiors weren't often dark and dank like we imagine in so much media. Many castles were painted wall to wall to be colorful and vibrant. I mean, of course, people had to live in them and wanted to show off, so I guess this isn't that unrealistic. LEGO used yellow bricks at the time, so kids would be less likely to build tanks or other war machines out of them. That didn't last. And look at how many minifigures it has, 14! They were doling them out like candy. And I like all the variety, those traveling knights wearing the emblems of several different houses. They didn't even have a proper horse mold yet. You had to build them up with normal pieces. We'd see a horse piece in the 80s, and this is where Castle really took shape, where it settled into a groove for a couple of decades. It's fun seeing them repurpose pieces for other uses. Before they released a proper ore piece, you had to row with your spear. Also lots of space hoses. This era focused on the Lion Knights and the Black Falcons, who seemed to come into conflict a lot but always had a good laugh judging by their smiles. I kinda like how simple and practical this tower looks. You couldn't sell that to kids these days. You'd have to cover it with gears and teeth and glowy bits, but a lot of these early siege machines were very dark and streamlined, shaped with basic LEGO plates and such. The minimalism is pretty slick if a little bleak, and because of that I think these have aged surprisingly gracefully. Towards the end of the 80s, they started introducing new factions like the Black Knights, Crusaders, and Forestmen. I like those completely black trees. It's not like they didn't have brown pieces yet, they just went in this direction for some reason. I especially like how the towers seem to be built into the trees. The castles themselves grew bigger and more realistic in some ways, not yet focusing much on fantastical elements. What's neat is they didn't suddenly put a lid on the old factions and switch to all these new ones at once. They mixed it up for a couple of years, keeping the old teams going while slowly phasing them out to get kids used to the changes. And really, the Crusaders and Black Knights weren't all that different from the Lions and Falcons, basically the same characters but with new names. But we still saw other factions like the Wolfpack arise. These days, LEGO wouldn't have this many facets of one theme running around all at once because it might create confusion. But for a while, Castle became this huge bustling world with so much going on, kinda like LEGO Space at its peak. By 1990 though, Castle had fully transitioned to a new generation. And yeah, you can see the builds are getting cleaner, more advanced, a little edgier. Which brings us back to the dragons, the first of many eras we won't cover in depth a second time. I will say though, this marked a turning point for Castle. Up until this point, you might see the occasional ghost, but this is where wizards, dragons, and other less historical elements started taking over. And this is something fans of earlier Castle's relative realism have grappled with for many years. 1995's Royal Knight stood out for being the first line to depict an actual king, crown and all. It had a flair and panache that was only implied in previous waves. I'm not sure what I can say about the Dark Forest line that I couldn't say about Forest Men. I mainly like its atmosphere, the minifigs, the clearing with a castle in the distance, probably from one of those other lines. It filled the cracks of this world, made it feel more expansive and populated. I think there should always be a faction like this mixed in, and I would probably have more fun with these than the more typical castles and knights. And from here we jump way ahead to the late 2000s. We did see a couple of old sets re-released in the early 2000s, and there was that neat My Own Creation set that fits in perfectly with those old ones. I guess you could say Knights Kingdom 1 was the end of that old aesthetic, and even that was drifting into juniorization. Something I didn't realize before, this castle from the final wave of Knights Kingdom 2 is basically a giant reference to the original Knights Kingdom castle. I always felt it was just a little out of place with the new one. It didn't perfectly fit Knights Kingdom 2, but it's nice regardless. Our next stop is the fantasy era. As the name implies, this leaned hard into fantasy races like trolls and skeleton people and dragons. It was basically the humans and dwarves versus everyone else, and LEGO evidently didn't have a problem with beards anymore. And I gotta hand it to them, the builds and colors are pretty solid. Like that double wheel thing is just epically dumb, and I love how the trolls are moving it. It's not my favorite castle theme by any stretch, but it's probably the most action-packed of them all. This skeleton still has facial hair. This box set is a bit misleading. That ball isn't anywhere near as huge as it looks here. Curiously, this evil wizard has Ogle's face, which makes me wonder if he could be another of Ogle's ancestors. And that castle's underbite is just impressive. Now that's how you do a giant brick-built skull. It puts most of the others to shame. And the troll's fortress is appropriately massive. The only real weak point for me was the dragons. This was an awkward time when LEGO gave up on fully brick-built dragons for a bit, something I lauded Vikings for and celebrate in more recent lines. These are treated like LEGO's dinosaurs still are, for the most part. And I know the oldest dragons were simple like that too, but I could kinda forgive them because they're so much smaller. Anyway, good line. One of the more diverse castle themes to be sure. Kinda reminds me of that earlier transition between eras. This was followed up by kingdoms. Ugh, that's a man kebab waiting to happen. The first couple years dropped the fantasy bits and went back to basics, with the Lion Knights and Dragon Knights. I quite like the color schemes. The red versus green isn't that common in LEGO, especially red being the good guys. The barn is probably my favorite set here. It's so big and cushy looking, it just makes me happy. I also like how this castle opens up to form an outer wall, so you could add other structures behind it, really give it some depth. And we don't often see softer, painterly backgrounds like these. Those are nice, especially like those trees. I think these might be some of the best castle sets LEGO's ever produced, and some of the most overlooked. I admire its restraint. The first half ended in a really interesting way, with what appears to be a Black Falcon knight with the same logo and everything showing up for a joust. Then we get to the second half, which is just more of the same, really. We've got another dragon, another evil wizard, the Lion Knights are blue again. There's just not much I can say about these builds that I haven't already said about other ones. I think this box art is some of the worst. It's too clean, too toyish. It makes these look like some off-brand. It's just weirdly off-putting. I think this wave went under the radar for me, and others judging by it being the last traditional castle wave. Well, sort of. We did get this nugget in 2016, a classic castle minifig with a slightly modernized take on this old thing. This is it. This is the last castle set. Ever. And what a tease. I'm sure there are many castle fans out there who would love to see a little more of classic castle given this treatment. But they didn't get that. And there's something I've realized about two recently retired lines I quite enjoyed, which have both appeared on the show, Nexo Knights and Elves. I do consider these castle themes, but I see why many don't. Each one is missing something that the other has. Nexo Knight sets focused mainly on vehicles and mechs, not so much the land itself, just siege machines and occasionally a castle, while Elves was all about the setting, with tree houses, villages, and castles aplenty, full of homey details like bookshelves, beds, pantries. They feel like spaces that people could actually live in, which of course is the entire appeal of a dollhouse, and something that people would expect to have at least a little of in a more traditional castle theme. Nexo Knight's limited interior space was more dedicated to readying for battle. So instead of one theme that had all of these elements in moderation, we got two that each had their own extreme. One completely militarized, and the other more cozy and lived in. And if you're one of those middle-of-the-road castle fans, they're each failing to deliver the other half of whatever authentic experience it is you want, on top of it being unrealistic or too futuristic or whatnot. Like those animals from Elves last year, those are their gods. The fire lion is a source of all fire, the turtle creates water, etc. That witch wants to absorb their power, the life force of an entire world, into herself, leaving the elves' world a lifeless lump. Well guys, it's been fun, but I guess there's nothing left to do but see if we starve, thirst, suffocate, or freeze to death first. Place your bets. Okay, that's pretty darn metal. Like, that is an awesome premise, exactly my kind of story. But it's not traditional, you know? Then you have something like Harry Potter, which seems like the perfect castle theme to me, even with the fantasy aspects. You've got that mix, with action set pieces like the Express, the Night Bus, etc., and also those affectionately decorated, livable aspects of Hogwarts itself. I don't know when or if we'll ever see a proper castle theme again, but I think it's a bit early to say no. It used to be one of the core pillars of LEGO, part of its image, and I just don't see it falling off the map forever. Kids may not be that into the aesthetic right now, but someday there'll be sufficient demand for some kind of resurgence, and for pirates, and for space. But for now, I hope people appreciate what a juggernaut this theme was in all its forms. That's it for today. If you want to support my work, please consider my graphic novel series, Planet Ripple. You can buy the books on Amazon or read an early draft of the first book for free. And for the Bionicle fans in my audience, there's the Toa, my ultimate love letter to the original series. Links to everything in the description. So, 3 episodes left. Not that many stones left unturned. This was one of the last big ones. We're gonna have to go way back from here. Toodles!
The The Legoland Castle. You build it for action. You can build the castle, then open up the wall, and pretend the knight jumps on his horse when he hears the bugle call.
The action's up to you.
Or you can pretend the guard calls out. The tournament will begin. So you lower the drawbridge, send out the knights, and hope that your side wins.
The action's up to you.
The Legoland Castle from the Legoland Collection comes with everything you see here from Lego Systems.